Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I wanted to talk this week about carbohydrates. I've written a lot about carbohydrates on my blog. I talk a lot about carbohydrates in these videos. And I make general recommendations for people to improve their health by eating more whole grains, by eating more legumes, by trying to remove refined carbohydrates from their diet. And that's a general recommendation that I think is necessary to make. But on top of that general recommendation, there are nuances within carbohydrate metabolism that are quite interesting. And I thought I would just have a brief discussion this week about the timing of carbohydrates. Now, it was Dan Duchaine that first drew my attention to this statement, that there's no such thing as a bad carbohydrate, there is just a mistimed carbohydrate. And ever since I've read that, maybe 20 years ago, it's always stuck in my head, and I've always believed that. I think it was a very insightful thing to say. Dan Duchaine, if you don't know who he is, was a person that came to prominence in America as a nutritionist and as a steroid guru. He was a bit of a maverick, and he was one of the first people to write a book for bodybuilders on steroid use. But he was also well known for writing about nutrition, and some of the things he wrote were very insightful. And I consider him possibly a genius. Some of the things he said have stuck with me for a long time. His book, Body Opus, is quite an interesting read. It's one of my favourite books. I've read it many times. And there's a lot of useful information in there for those people that train. I consider the book to contain a lot of possibly things I don't agree with, borderline dangerous things in terms of consumption of the amounts of sugars he recommends. But if you take the book as an overview and you look at some of his information, it's actually a very insightful book, and I don't think anyone's really written a better dieting book since Body Opus. So if you have the chance to get hold of a copy, it's very hard to get hold of now. There are second-hand copies going around on the internet, but if you can get a copy, it's actually quite a good read. And there is a review of Body Opus on my blog if you want to have a look at the sort of things that are in there. But Dan Duchaine was interested in dieting, and he came up with this suggestion that there's no such thing as a bad carbohydrate, only a mistimed carbohydrate. Now, if we go into some detail, we can see that's quite insightful, because the general recommendation to eat whole grains, the general recommendation to avoid refined carbohydrate, is based on the fact that the average person doesn't do much exercise. They're probably consuming possibly a Western diet, and they could benefit from modulating their blood sugar levels. Most people consume too much carbohydrate, and they also consume too much refined carbohydrate. That has a negative effect on blood sugar levels. Most people consume too much sugar, which contains fructose, and that has a negative effect on insulin. So for most people, the recommendation to consume less sugar, to consume less refined carbohydrates, to consume more whole grains is a good recommendation. And in general life, that is what you should base your diet on. You should base, if you're going to eat grains, they should be whole grain sources. You should eat more sources of fruits and vegetables to get your carbohydrates, and you should avoid refined carbohydrates, white bread, white flour, products with white flour in them, and products with sugar in them, because they tend to have detrimental effects on your blood sugar levels and your insulin levels of insulin resistance. But if we look at somebody who perhaps does a lot of physical activity, that can be going to the gym, it might be playing a sport, it could also be somebody who works using manual labour. People that work on a building site, for example, expend large amounts of energy throughout the day. These people require carbohydrates in their diet in order to be able to replenish the stores of energy that they use during their endeavours. And the types of carbohydrate they may use can actually differ from those that would be normally recommended to a sedentary person. If you've been sat on the sofa, if you've been lying in bed, your requirement for carbohydrate for your particular metabolism is very different to somebody who has just done an ultra marathon, for example. And this is where the concept of timing of carbohydrates comes in. If you are sedentary and you've done no activity, your glycogen levels will likely be fairly full, fairly topped up. The liver glycogen will deplete during the night because it's one of the sources of glucose for your brain. But you will always need to top up your glycogen, but you probably won't have too much depletion in your skeletal muscle, and therefore your requirement for the total amount of carbohydrates you consume and the types of carbohydrates will be quite different. You would want to emphasize perhaps a lower carbohydrate diet. You'd want to consume mainly whole grains. You'd want to avoid sources of fructose, which could cause insulin resistance. And you would follow the general recommendations that most nutritionists would give for carbohydrate in the diet. Now, if you go to somebody who's doing physical activity, their requirements are very different because their metabolism is very different. They have very likely depleted levels of glycogen in their muscles. If you've been using your muscles, the glycogen, the storage form of carbohydrate, glycogen within your muscles gets depleted. And you want to, after you've performed your physical activity, or perhaps during even, replenish your blood sugar levels and your glycogen levels. And you would perhaps turn to different carbohydrates to be able to do that. Now, if we look at exercise, exercise will deplete glycogen from both the liver and from the skeletal muscle. And following exercise, if you consume glucose, you tend to preferentially resynthesize glycogen in your muscle. If you consume fructose, you tend to preferentially resynthesize the glycogen in your liver. So it makes sense after a workout, after training, after physical activity to be able to consume, to be able to fully replenish your glycogen in both your liver and your skeletal muscle. It makes sense to have a source of fructose and of glucose. And the other requirement after physical activity is we actually want the sugars to get into our system very quickly. Now that's the opposite of what you normally want when you're sedentary. You actually want the sugars to trickle into your blood as slowly as possible, and that allows your cells, particularly your liver cells, to have time to deal with the energy. If we push too much energy into our liver cells, they become overloaded. We get the nutrient overload syndrome, and this causes the metabolism of the liver to shift more towards the production of fatty acids, because as the pathways fill up, as the pathways are activated, the safety valve within the liver, if there is a lot of nutrients, is to push things into the creation of fatty acids. So really, when we're sedentary, we want to trickle the carbohydrates into our blood slowly so that the liver has time to process them down the correct metabolic pathways, and that will improve our overall blood sugar control. After exercise, really the liver, the skeletal muscle, the blood sugar levels will be depleted of glucose, and there's a requirement to get nutrients into the body quickly. So it's a completely different strategy. At this point, the types of carbohydrate that are often not recommended are actually beneficial. Refined crystalline fructose will synthesize very efficiently, will synthesize liver glycogen after heavy physical activity. Glucose in powder form will very quickly raise blood sugar levels. It will very quickly replete glycogen levels in muscle. So powdered forms of carbohydrates, something that is not usually recommended for general health, are actually beneficial after physical activity. And a lot of people take advantage of this. A lot of people with a sweet tooth, a lot of people that can't give up these sugars can actually time them well to have them after physical activity, so they don't have a detrimental effect on your health. If you look at most sports drinks, they contain glucose, but they're often absent of the fructose. And I think after exercise, fructose is important for resynthesizing liver glycogen. So something like fruit juice would be quite good. Certain fruits have both fructose and glucose in them, and most fruits have a mixture of sugars. So fruit juice diluted with water is probably a very good food to have after a workout. And again, I normally say don't don't consume fruit juice because there's no fibre there, and therefore the nutrients get into your system too quickly, and that causes the nutrient overload syndrome. But after physical activity, that's a benefit. The removal of the fibre allows the sugars to get into the system quickly. You then resynthesize your liver glycogen and your skeletal muscle glycogen more quickly. Your blood sugar levels return to normal. That allows you to think more clearly, because obviously your blood sugar levels determine how well your brain works, and your system goes back to normal homeostasis more quickly if you have those types of sugars in your diet after you've performed activity. The types of sugars that you should eat that you should consume before physical activity. Some people like to consume carbohydrates before they perform their physical activity, perhaps because they're a runner and they don't like to consume whole foods. Some people don't want a full stomach when they're off to run 10 kilometers or more, and so they turn to perhaps carbohydrate drinks and those kind of more convenient lighter foods. In that situation, really, it's glucose that would be what you would want in the drink. At that point, you haven't depleted your liver glycogen levels, and therefore there's not really a requirement for fructose. So, in a pre-workout drink, I would emphasise glucose. In a post-workout drink, I would emphasise both fructose and glucose. Something else I agreed with Dan Duchesne about was that after a workout, it's more important to have carbohydrates than protein. Many people on the internet, on videos, in blogs, talk about the benefits of protein, whey protein, having your protein after your workout. I kind of disagree with that. I think that the most important thing is to get sugars and water into the system. I think rehydration and the resynthesis of glycogen is far more important than protein synthesis. Protein synthesis will occur in a window after your workout, but I think that the time directly after your workout is the time that you should be consuming liquids and sugars in order to be able to replenish your blood glucose levels and also replenish your glycogen levels. So protein is important after your workout. I'm not saying it isn't, but I think in terms of timing, you need to emphasize carbohydrates and water after your workout. And once you've digested those, once you've absorbed those, then look at perhaps another drink that is protein based to increase your protein synthesis rates, particularly if you've been doing something like resistance training. If you consume them together, you will likely delay the absorption of the sugars. I don't think it would make that much difference to the average trainer, but if I had to optimize a strategy, I would consume a carbohydrate drink during or after my workout. I would then wait until I thought that had been absorbed, which might be 15 to 20 minutes, and then I would look at consuming protein. Now, after you've consumed your carbohydrates directly after your workout, within most people would want to look at a window within about 15 to 20 minutes after their workout. You still have quite a long window of opportunity there to be able to consume more refined carbohydrates. I would suggest that there's probably a 2-hour window after your workout where consumption of refined carbohydrates is maybe even beneficial. And that window may be even longer if you've been performing very intense or exercise of very long duration. So refined rice, refined breakfast cereals, all the things, white bread, all the things that I say normally don't eat, are perhaps beneficial in that 2-hour window. If you look at some of the athletes that perform extreme sports, something like the Tour de France, they're out on the road all day on their bicycles. They have a time in the evening where they have to replenish all of their energy reserves from that exertion. Having a lot of fibre, a lot of protein, a lot of other things in their stomach that are going to slow the absorption of the food that they do eat is perhaps going to be detrimental. So they would probably want to emphasise refined sources of carbohydrates, particularly just to speed the absorption of them in order to be able to fit the amount of calories they would have to eat into a smaller period of time. So as you can see, when you look into it, the timing of carbohydrates is quite interesting. It's an art, not a science. This is really something. This is where science departs from reality. Science is very good at looking at a particular variable, but I find that scientists and scientific papers are very good in their particular area, but most research scientists who are nutritionists don't have an overview of other areas, and a lot of this this art of nutrition is missing from our research. There are so many errors in papers where people have overlooked factors that are quite obvious to many nutritionists, but they don't really have an understanding of nutrition as a whole. They're just scientists looking at a particular area, and they're very good within that area, but they can't look at the whole picture. And I think this timing of carbohydrates, you do find in the sports nutrition literature, obviously emphasis on certain carbohydrate drinks and sports and rehydration drinks. And then if you look at the maybe more the more clinical nutrition papers, you find the research into whole grains and all of the types of carbohydrates like legumes that that I recommend as a daily kind of regime to be able to be healthy, and there's no crossover of the two. There's no real communication between the two groups, and this timing of carbohydrates is very important. Dan Duchesne was quite right. There's no such thing really as a bad carbohydrate. You can still obviously overeat fructose if you're physically active, but it's much harder to do that, and this is one of the reasons that exercise I think is so protective of obesity. It's nothing to do with this absurd notion that exercise causes calorie burning. If you actually look at the amount of calories that are burnt during exercise, the body is so efficient at movement that the amount of calories is so minuscule compared with how many calories you burn just through normal metabolic regulation when you're asleep. If you look at the amount of calories you burn during the night when you're asleep, just in your protein synthesis, rebuilding your muscles, maintenance of the body, breaking down the bone, rebuilding the bone, that it uses a factor of magnitude greater amount of energy than any exercise. And this notion that exercise causes you to remain lean because it's burning calories, I think, is absurd. And anybody that knows, that's looked into this in detail, I think should really honestly agree with that. I mean, it seems preposterous. What I think exercise does is it prepares the metabolism of the body to be able to better cope with poor quality foods. It sensitizes the skeletal muscle to insulin, which allows particular foods to have less of a detrimental effect. So if you were consuming lots of soft drinks and you're exercising at the same time, obviously the fructose in those soft drinks, rather than going to be converted to fatty acids in the liver and then causing insulin resistance, are going to be converted to glycogen instead, and therefore they have less of a detrimental effect. They cause less weight gain. It's not because you're burning the fructose, it's because you've pre-prepared the body to be able to accept the fructose and put it down a more useful metabolic pathway. And I think this is really the key to exercise. People don't get the maximum amount of exercise in terms of looking after their physiques, improving their body compositions, because they don't really understand what the exercise is doing. The exercise is preparing the ground. It's creating a metabolic situation that can better accept the food that you're going to eat. Now, if that's high quality food, the exercise is less relevant. But if the food is of low quality and you've pre-prepared your metabolism to be able to be ready to utilize that energy in a particular way, to use it as something useful, that is not going to have a detrimental effect on your body composition to the same degree as if you were sedentary. And I think that's really the key to understanding exercise. It's the key to improving your body composition. You need to think of exercise as a way of changing your metabolism. It's a way of preparing the ground for what's coming in the future, which is your food that you're going to eat. If on top of the exercise you provide your body with the highest quality nutrition, the highest quality sources of carbohydrates, and you time them correctly, then your body composition is going to improve, because you're going to be providing the right nutrition for the particular metabolic activity inside your inside your body. The metabolic activity that you've created will be perfectly honed to the nutrition you're providing. Now, if you do exercise and you provide low quality nutrition, you're obviously going to be in better shape than if you do no exercise and have low quality nutrition, because at least some of the detrimental effects will be overcome by the metabolism that you have set up. So really, I want the take-home message from this is to think of carbohydrates as really things that you should consider in terms of when you take them. As a general recommendation, I still stand by, if I had to make a general recommendation, I would say that any grains that you do eat should be of whole grain. Most of your carbohydrate intake should come really from fruits and vegetables, emphasizing vegetables. And I think that carbohydrate intake should be maybe quite isocaloric for a normal person. So no more than about 40% of total calories should be carbohydrate. However, this video illustrates that there are exceptions to that, and really this subject is too broad to go into in such a small amount of time, so you need to do your own research. But if you can go away from this video with the concept that there is a time and a place to eat different types of carbohydrates, and as long as you moderate your intake of those carbohydrates, even refined crystalline fructose, which is the devil in terms of for most nutritionists, it's a disease-causing metabolic poison. But even that, in moderation at the right time, just as alcohol in moderation at the right time can have health benefits. Fructose, the same can be said of fructose, the same can be said of powdered glucose, the same can be said of powdered sucrose. I've certainly consumed powdered fructose, powdered sucrose, powdered glucose in my training career, and I don't think it's done any long-term damage. I do occasionally drink alcohol, and I don't think that's done any long-term damage. But timing these chemicals, these foods correctly, and tuning your metabolism to accept them and use them in the best way is really the way that you're going to improve your body composition the most. So if you're looking for 10% body fat, if you're looking to improve, the muscle on your physique, if you're looking to become healthier and fitter, have a look and research carbohydrates and see what you think would be best for you, and try to go beyond the general recommendations, and try to think of this as more of an art than a science, because much of this is not in the scientific literature. It's little bits of it are, but you have to pull them out to create the larger picture. If you have any comments on this video, then please leave them in the comments box below, and I will try to get back to you. If you're interested in this type of subject, then if you want to check out my blog, which is robertbarrington.net, there are many articles on this sort of subject. So I hope that was interesting, and I will see you again soon for another video.